I've heard the reign of the Alexanders referred to as the Second Imperium. This is a mistake. It remained the same Imperium, but there had been a revolution in leadership, an expulsion of a treacherous and pathetic dynasty that never should have existed. From time to time, the old dynasty would find the backbone to raise its head and bare what it thought were teeth, only to be kicked back into place where it belonged.
It is impossible to comprehend the transformation that took place within a few short years following the expulsion of the Gerard dynasty. The Imperium that had been about to fragment under its own decay abruptly found itself drawn back to the center like never before. This was no simple revolution or an overthrow of a decrepit old order. This was a renaissance, and it was long overdue.
The newly elected Emperor Alexander Carruthers wasted no time in establishing his authority. The words of Gerard IV's abdication were still hanging in the air when the deposed emperor was drawn into the humiliating ordeal of being forced to officiate his successor's enthronement. Alexander would immediately take possession of the long-disused imperial palace on Belle Isle, becoming the first emperor to actually reside in the palace. Together with Prime Minister Thomason, he would craft a number of proposals to be immediately placed before the Convention of Houses. His first step was to call for a meeting of the Convention of Worlds, something which had not happened since the formal establishment of the Imperium in 2078. This meeting of the Convention of Worlds would bring with it unanticipated complications. When the last meeting had occurred, the Imperium had consisted of a few dozen colony worlds, and the selection of delegates had been a simple affair. Now, with over 2,000 worlds and multiple species, even this seemingly simple step proved unexpectedly difficult. The Imperial Charter did not lay out in any detail how the selection of delegates to the Convention of Worlds was to be done, or even how representation was to be apportioned beyond that it was to be made up of representatives elected from each world, regardless of which house the worlds belonged to. Even this seemingly simple first step would take weeks of negotiation, finally settling on the population of the smallest colony to be used as the basis for apportioning representatives. Yet even this decision raised additional problems when it was found that the last official census had been done under the reign of Gerard II. Since that time, the population was estimated based on the residency and personal identification records provided by each house individually. As every house had their own requirements and varying forms of personal identification, no standardized form existed within the Imperium. This was one of a number of issues Prime Minister Thomason had been attempting to rectify, but had met with opposition in the Convention of Houses. Alexander cut through this opposition with a judicial edict, declaring that equality before the law required a standardization of identification. As the Supreme Justice in the Imperium, Alexander proactively used his judicial authority to resolve a bureaucratic dilemma in a way the Gerards had steadfastly avoided. When the heads of a number of houses protested this use of judicial authority, Alexander used his veto power to invalidate their acceptance as imperial houses. This action highlighted the flaws in the Imperial Charter which only a Convention of Worlds could resolve, as the Charter had placed no limit on the veto power of the Emperor. This allowed Alexander to claim the power to veto any decision made by any official within the Imperium since its establishment. This was a power the Gerards had been afraid of wielding, but one Alexander would use to great effect. Realizing that he could not effectively wield his veto power unless he was informed of decisions, he would request weekly briefings from Prime Minister Thomason where they would review the major decisions of the previous week. This was something Thomason had attempted with Gerard IV, but had been met with indifference. Now the two would work together, Alexander using his veto power to reverse decisions Thomason lacked the legal authority to correct. They would use these meetings to selectively chip away at the excessive powers claimed by the imperial houses, re-establish the imperial control of the judiciary, and re-implement standards across the Imperium. With this underway, Alexander then stepped into another area the Gerards had avoided, the imperial fleet. While the Emperor was technically the commander-in-chief of imperial forces, these forces had never actually been established. What the Gerards had relied upon were the independent forces of the imperial houses, dispatching an admiral to oversee joint operations as the need arose. However, as the recent imperial war between houses Gerard and Thomason had shown, there was a disparity in the quality of the forces of the various houses. What the defense of the Imperium called for was an imperial fleet with standardized weapons and training under a single command. Following the advice of Prime Minister Thomason, Alexander would use his authority as Commander-in-Chief to establish the Grand Armada, rather than consolidate all the house fleets into a single command. The Grand Armada was portrayed as the primary offensive force of the Imperium, with the fleets of the imperial houses remaining the primary defensive force. This decision was made to avoid openly antagonizing the imperial houses, who would take any assumption of their fleets as an openly hostile act and start a new imperial war. With the establishment of the imperial fleet underway, Alexander would turn his attention to a more personal matter, the imperial palace. The Belle Isle Palace had never been intended as an imperial residence, but rather as a corporate retreat for Thomason Holdings. As a result, it was more like a large hotel than a functional palace. Aaron Thomason had established an administrative capital, and now Alexander would found an imperial one. He would immediately set his eyes upon Istanbul, which still held many relics of the Byzantine and Ottoman empires. Negotiations for the purchase of the old city of Constantinople would meet a major obstacle when Turkey demanded the exorbitant price of 1/3 of the imperial treasury. Initially taken aback by the price demanded, Alexander would attempt to negotiate, ultimately talking Turkey down to 20%. He remained reluctant to commit to this, however, as the sudden release of that much of the treasury would deflate the Terran dollar almost immediately. The solution would come from Prime Minister Thomason. In a review of treasury assets following his appointment as Prime Minister, Thomason had noted that the imperial treasury did not only hold substantial amounts of the gold backing the Terran dollar and the silver backing the common dollar, but it held a large reserve of unutilized platinum. Thomason would suggest the creation of a new currency backed by this platinum reserve, to be distributed exclusively at the discretion of the emperor to pay for large projects. Alexander would approve of this proposal, purchasing Constantinople with this new imperial dollar. As the gold in circulation remained unchanged, this maintained the stability of the Terran dollar. Turkey would be responsible for using the funds obtained to purchase the homes and businesses in Constantinople to then give to the Imperium. The work in Constantinople would earn Alexander the epithet of the bulldozer, as the entire city was systematically demolished. Prime Minister Thomason would quietly intervene in certain cases, arranging for the relocation of various historic buildings to other locations for preservation or reuse. By the end of the demolition, the only buildings remaining intact were the Hagia Sophia and the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, which had been claimed by the Foreign Ministry. Construction of the new palace would begin almost immediately with the construction of the Imperial Throne Room. A massive edifice mirroring the Hagia Sophia, the building dwarfed anything previously used by any emperor of the Imperium. Construction would also begin on an official meeting place for the convention of houses within the new palace complex and key government structures. To placate the nervous imperial houses, Alexander set aside virtually the entire southern half of the complex to be used for the construction of villas for each imperial house. While Alexander would provide the land, it was the responsibility of each house to construct their own residences. While portrayed as allowing each house to display its unique identity, the reality was that the costs of the project were already ballooning well past any of the initial estimates Alexander had envisioned. Eager to be established in the new capital, Alexander would live in a massive tent complex to the east of the Hagia Sophia while construction was underway. It was here that on the morning of June 8, 2161, Alexander would be found dead, the result of an undetected aneurysm. His completely unexpected death would result in the selection of an emperor by a group that had never done so before, the Convention of Worlds. the unexpected death of Emperor Alexander Carruthers threw the government of the Imperium into chaos. Under the terms of the Imperial Charter, Prime Minister Thomason was to take the throne. This was something Thomason had no interest in doing. He had found that he had far more influence as Prime Minister than he would as Emperor. With the throne vacant, the Convention of Houses would persuade Thomason to accept the temporary position of Lord Protector of the Imperium. Included in the Imperial Charter as an afterthought, the Lord Protector was intended to act as a form of regent, overseeing the Imperium during the expected transition from one emperor to another. Thomason would accept this position and help guide the Convention of Houses as it considered a new emperor. This process would receive a challenge from an unexpected opponent, former Emperor Gerard IV. Taking a stance that many at the time considered ironic, he insisted that the terms of the succession were clear and that Thomason was the new emperor. He would emphasize this by addressing Thomason in the Convention of Houses as His Imperial Majesty. This forced Thomason to again state that he was uninterested in taking the throne, and that the Convention of Houses would choose a new emperor. Howard Carruthers, the eldest son of Alexander, would offer to take the throne, promising to continue the work his father had started. He had been friendly towards Gerard in his captivity, often checking on him and paying social calls to ensure he was comfortable and well cared for. It was therefore a surprise when Gerard stood in opposition. The former emperor's position was simple. Under the terms of the Compromise of 2095, it was now the turn of House Gerard to take the throne. When Gerard stated this argument, Prime Minister Thomason and his allied houses could only stare in disbelief. House Gerard had always disregarded the compromise, and now he was insisting that it be applied. Thomason would finally state that the compromise had been rendered invalid by House Gerard's repeated violations of it. Gerard then took an utterly unexpected approach. He suggested that the election of the new emperor not be done by the Convention of Houses as stipulated by the Imperial Charter, but by the Convention of Worlds, which was beginning to gather in the capital. Gerard knew he was not popular with the Convention of Houses, and was hoping his time spent traveling as emperor would give him the support needed elsewhere. What he failed to take into account, however, was that the Convention of Worlds was unwieldy and all but impossible to organize. With over 100,000 delegates and representatives speaking 130 languages and including 6 different species, the Convention of Worlds could not even agree on what procedures to follow. Organizing debates was utterly impossible, and votes resembled political campaigns rather than legislation. Thomason had realized this when the procedures for the allocation of representatives had been decided upon, but Alexander had pushed for the meeting to continue regardless. Now Gerard placed his hopes for reclaiming the throne on this inoperable body of government. As Lord Protector of the Imperium, Thomason stood in for the Emperor in opening the Convention of Worlds, announcing that Gerard would speak before the convention the next day, and Howard Carruthers the day following. Gerard would awake the next morning violently ill and unable to speak before the convention. Thomason graciously allowed Gerard and Carruthers to reverse their speaking order to give time for the former emperor to recover. That afternoon, however, tests would reveal that Gerard had been poisoned. The dose of the toxin had been carefully measured to make him ill, but not to kill him. While unwilling to suspect Howard Carruthers himself, he believed that someone within House Carruthers was responsible. A visibly angry Thomason would order a full, comprehensive investigation into the poisoning, assuring Gerard that no resource would be left untapped in finding the perpetrator. Nonetheless, Gerard understood the intent behind the attempted poisoning and withdrew his claim to the throne. The Convention of Worlds would vote the following day to name Howard Carruthers as the new emperor, with the Convention of Houses following suit the next day. The investigation into the poisoning would ultimately settle on a member of Gerard's own household staff. This person had retired immediately after the attempt, and a thorough search by the Imperial Security Services and Fleet Special Operations was unable to locate him. The case would be closed unresolved. After the fall of the Imperium, researchers would discover evidence that the poisoning had been carried out on orders of Aaron Thomason. While appearing neutral as the Lord Protector of the Imperium, he had no desire to see a return to Gerard rule. His personally heading the investigation allowed him to manipulate the evidence, preventing the discovery of the person who planted the poison. With Gerard neutralized and Howard Carruthers elected as the new emperor, Thomason was now free to begin planning the next phase of imperial power.
When you look at all the pomp and pageantry that surrounds the Emperor of the Terran Imperium, you are looking into the mind of Alexander II. Before him, the Emperor was simply another citizen of the Imperium. He was the architect not only of the new palace, but of the Imperium as the galaxy remembers it.
Alexander II was the embodiment of the Imperium, and he would reshape everything around him into his image. The Gerards may claim the credit for founding the Imperium, but what they made was crumbling mud brick. Alexander took that and turned it into gilded marble.
Seen by many as vain, pretentious, and arrogant, Alexander II was perfect for the role he had inherited. He wielded his reputation like a scalpel in the hands of a skilled surgeon, making even the simplest human moments carry more impact. Under his reign, the Emperor was no longer some distant, almost imaginary figure. He was real, tangible, flawed in relatable human ways. But above all, he was present in ways nobody had thought an emperor could be.
Howard Carruthers would plan the most extravagant and lavish coronation seen in imperial history, at a cost estimated to be greater than that of all the previous emperors combined. With only 1 month given to plan and arrange the coronation, 50,000 workers labored around the clock to prepare the still under construction palace for the event. The day of his coronation was declared an imperial holiday, the first of many traditions that would be carried through until the fall of the Imperium. The formal coronation was followed by a day of festivities in various locations across Terra, all meticulously coordinated to take place at sunrise. The new emperor would miss no opportunity to display his wealth, status, or power, declaring an imperial pardon for a wide variety of minor violations of imperial law, and tax forgiveness for all those who owed less than 100,000 Terran dollars in back taxes. The festivities would conclude with the dramatic nighttime demolition of the Belle Isle Palace with plasma bombs, marking the official relocation of the imperial residence to Constantinople. Aware of his own inexperience, he would ask Prime Minister Aaron Thomason to mentor him in his new role as emperor, a task Thomason readily accepted. It would be at this time that former Emperor Gerard IV would give Thomason the epithet that remains to this day, the Shadow Emperor. He would advise Alexander to remove Thomason as soon as possible and appoint a new prime minister. Alexander would respond by releasing the remaining Gerard hostages and immediately embarking on a tour of the Imperium, leaving Thomason in charge of the capital. While receiving frequent briefings remotely, Alexander was taking no mere vacation as Gerard IV had often done. Instead, he was visiting worlds from which unusually high numbers of appeals had been received, choosing to hear the cases publicly and in person on the worlds on which the cases were based. On several occasions, he was known to return to worlds upon hearing that his judgments were not being carried out. This tour would have another effect on the young emperor, and that was to notice the incredible disorganization of imperial administration. While Prime Minister Thomason had successfully reorganized the upper levels of the imperial government, the administration relied on the imperial houses for the implementation of policy at the lower levels. He began to get an appreciation for the former Mykensian Republic sector system and wanted to implement something similar within the Imperium. Referring to these as administrative regions rather than sectors in a memo to Prime Minister Thomason, Alexander would ask if something like this was actually possible. Thomason had wanted this for some time, but lacked the standing to suggest it. Making a few minor corrections to Alexander's memo, he would submit it directly to the Convention of Worlds for consideration. Many would speculate that this was precisely the reason Thomason had agreed so readily with the proposed tour. In addition, it was Thomason that decided which worlds would be included in the tour, saving the worlds of House Thomason for the end. Alexander II loved being emperor and relished every moment. He was at heart a performer, the galaxy was now his stage, and he had cast himself in the role of hero. When people expected a grandiose emperor, that is what he was, but he was equally skilled at meeting people on their own level. Everyone he spoke with felt like they had the complete attention of the most powerful person in the galaxy. The tour also allowed him to indulge in his other passion, architecture. The tour was often delayed when Alexander discovered some new building that fascinated him, taking detailed notes and making his own drawings to send back to the Chamberlain of the palace. These detailed notes and drawings would ultimately coalesce into the Grand Alexander Palace complex. Four outwardly identical palace buildings would line a broad boulevard extending from the throne room complex, decorated with statuary and fountains. Each of these buildings would serve a different purpose. One was the official imperial residence, including the personal working and entertainment spaces for the imperial family. Directly across from it was the Palace of the Prime Minister, designed as a mirror image but internally decorated in silver rather than gold. The third building contained the Grand Imperial Ballroom and Dining Room, as well as lodging for visiting dignitaries. The final building contained the offices for the staff of the palace administration. He would also make significant changes to the newly constructed Imperial Throne Room, describing it as bland and uninspiring. During the tour, he would redesign the throne room, personally designing most of the elements that make the structure unique today. Construction and renovation work would begin before Alexander returned from the tour, and much of the construction would not end until a pause was ordered by Emperor Trajan in 2214. The most discussed aspect of this new palace construction would not be the palaces themselves, but the grand fountain located at the center of the four structures. At 10 meters wide, the fountain included 5 water jets to represent the 5 previous emperors, and was topped by an oversized, gilded statue of Alexander II holding a torch over his head. The controversy over the fountain lay not in the fact that Alexander had chosen to include a statue of himself, but that he had chosen to portray himself nude. While this tour was underway, the Convention of Worlds continued meeting under the leadership of Prime Minister Thomason. It was here that Thomason began to show the level of control he actually held over the Imperium, as he was perhaps the only man to successfully utilize the unwieldy Convention of Worlds. Carefully maintaining the illusion of a balance of power, Thomason would gain the approval of both the Emperor and Convention of Houses before presenting proposals to the most influential members of the Convention of Worlds. They would in turn gain the support of the other delegates before he would present it to the convention as a whole. Carefully managing the presentation of proposals in this way, Thomason was able to push through most of the raft of reforms requested by Alexander I, as well as some added by Alexander II. Among these were the new administrative regions, clarification that the imperial judiciary was a wholly separate entity from the rest of the government, and a seemingly minor alteration to the order of succession. This last change was intended to correct the issues raised under the Gerard dynasty by altering the imperial charter to allow the throne to pass to either the prime minister or the emperor's designated successor. With this change, Alexander would name his younger brother Samuel as heir to the throne, in spite of his brother having no interest in the position. Samuel was content with his role on the board of directors of Carruthers Heavy Industries, where in spite of his inexperience he was gaining a reputation for asking pointed questions regarding the progress of projects. His appointment as the designated heir was interpreted as assuring Aaron Thomason that he was secure in his role as Prime Minister, regardless of what happened to the Emperor. It was on this first tour that Alexander would meet the talented singer and musician Lillian Carlisle, and the two were quickly engaged. This was not without its own controversy, as Carlisle was not of any house, and was considered a commoner by the emerging aristocracy. He would return from the tour with Carlisle and the daughter of another new minor imperial house, Amelia von Ryland. Amelia would soon find herself spending increasing amounts of time with Aaron Thomason, who seemed to also enjoy her company. The day following Alexander's marriage to Lillian Carlisle, it was quietly announced that Aaron Thomason would be marrying Amelia von Ryland the following month. They soon found their plans for a modest wedding being overridden by a gleeful Alexander, who took over the planning of the event himself. The subsequent wedding was on an imperial scale, attended by the heads of the imperial houses, foreign dignitaries, and celebrities from across the Imperium. Following the solemn wedding at the Hagia Sophia, the reception took place in the imperial throne room. Here the convention of houses was stunned to see the wedding party seated on the dais, with Alexander serving as best man and behaving as if Thomason was the emperor. Former Emperor Gerard IV, attending unwillingly, would comment that the true emperor had finally taken the throne. In an uncanny echo of the Gerard dynasty's policies, Alexander would not dispute this statement, replying that while Thomason may in fact rule the Imperium, as emperor he ensured he did so fairly and that justice was upheld. With dynastic matters settled, Alexander and Thomason set about further reforms to the Imperium. During the fall of the Second Mykentian Republic, civilians had evacuated en masse to shelters that became known as sanctuaries. In the chaos following the fall of the Republic, it had not been safe for the civilians to return. Many had banded together as the Restoration Republic under Pharaon Tuga in an effort to restore the Republic in 2056, only to be defeated by Triad forces in 2070. This had been the power vacuum into which the Imperium had expanded, and in the intervening years many sanctuaries had become isolated and cut off within imperial territory. Seeking a way to resolve this, Alexander and Thomason would issue the Open Door Edict, where all those still located in sanctuaries that were now within imperial territory would be granted residency status within the Imperium. This would give them freedom of travel and the ability to return to their ancestral homes if they wished. Doing so would also increase the tax base and provide a source of skilled labor that already understood the nuances of Mykentian technology. It would not be long after this policy was implemented that Lillian Carlisle gave birth to a son, Roman Alexander Carruthers. Months later, Amelia von Ryland would deliver Vincent Leon Thomason, giving both families heirs. The upbringing of both sons was very similar, with them being kept out of the eye of the public. Roman and Vincent would spend virtually their entire childhoods together, leading some to speculate that it was the intention of their fathers to have them emulate their own close relationship. Alexander and Thomason then set about reforming the process of imperial appeals. Under the imperial charter, any citizen of the Imperium had the right to appeal for justice directly to the emperor. Alexander was keen to handle as many of these cases as he could, but with thousands of them arriving daily, it was impossible to keep up. They would establish a board of appeals which would sort through the cases, determining which were significant enough to require the emperor to rule personally. All other cases would be handled by members of the board, but would still require the emperor's assent to their judgment. This significantly reduced the amount of time Alexander needed to spend attending to these matters. His earlier determination to hear appeals in person remained, however, and he would settle into a routine where he would tour the Imperium for 1 month hearing appeals, and then spend 1 month in the capital. It was during these tours that his personal vanity would begin to show when he began to use increasing amounts of cosmetics in an effort to conceal his age. While no direct order was issued, it became practice to not depict Alexander as anything but the youth he had been when taking the throne. Nonetheless, the constant tours to hear appeals and the subsequent obliteration of all circadian rhythms took a toll on the emperor. By 2172, it was obvious that this was detrimental to his health, but he remained determined to continue the practice. He would also become increasingly aware that his brother, as his designated heir, lacked the experience in government to assume the throne, and this would prompt him to re-evaluate the roles he and Thomason held. Aaron Thomason would agree to retire as prime minister, allowing Samuel to take his place in preparation for becoming emperor, while Thomason remained as an imperial advisor to both Samuel and Alexander. Alexander did not want to diminish Thomason's role, however, and would immediately issue two special dispensations to the Convention of Houses. The first was to grant Thomason the power of supremacy, giving him the power to overrule the prime minister if he felt a decision was in error. The second was the power of summons, allowing Thomason to summon any government official for any reason. These two dispensations effectively made Thomason prime minister, even if he no longer held the title. Aaron Thomason would also be made the head of the Board of Appeals, and would continue standing by Alexander's side at imperial functions. This arrangement would last until 2186, when Roman Carruthers completed service in the imperial fleet. Still not believing his son was prepared to take the throne, Alexander remained committed to his intention to have Samuel as his designated heir, instead naming Roman deputy prime minister. He had also intended to name Vincent Thomason deputy prime minister, but this was derailed when Aaron Thomason named Vincent as the legate of House Thomason to the Convention of Houses. In 2187, Roman would marry Aaron Thomason's daughter Irene, officially tying the two families together. On the morning of April 4, 2189, it would be announced that Alexander II had passed in his sleep, a result of overexerting himself traveling and attending to the elaborate court functions he himself had invented. Many would speculate that this would bring an end to the Shadow Emperor, but this would only be the beginning of his reign.
Alexander III was perhaps the least imperial of all the emperors. He always gave the impression that he was a man who was trying his best to fit a role he was not suited for. While he lacked his brother's charm and charisma, he had a sharp mind and was genuinely vested in being the best emperor he could be.
I've always had the impression that Alexander III was just trying to hold the Imperium together until his nephew could take the throne. Like Maximian II, he always seemed slightly uncomfortable.
Samuel Carruthers never wanted to be emperor. It was a position that was thrust upon him by his brother, who always felt his own son was lacking something. Yet he was also a man who had the best interests of the Imperium at heart. He could have attempted to wield imperial power himself, but instead he entrusted it to Aaron Thomason. As emperor, he was entitled to name his son Fabian heir to the throne, but instead named his nephew Roman, who he saw as a better emperor than he himself was. It is telling that when demeaningly asked by a mischievous noble what he thought his epithet should be, Alexander III replied simply, and without hesitation, the Consolidator.
Samuel Carruthers took the throne as Alexander III, unsure of himself. He had been comfortable as prime minister and confident of his abilities there, but in this new role he found himself utterly adrift. The Convention of Houses expected a quick decision on the appointment of a designated heir, and the new emperor faced a dilemma when confronting this. They clearly expected Alexander to name his son Fabian as the heir, and were already attempting to ingratiate themselves with him. As the only child of Alexander and his late wife Timea Aoki, Fabian himself held no expectation of being named the heir. Like his cousin Roman, Fabian had served in the fleet for a time and stated that if he was to hold any position, he would prefer being military consul. Alexander himself initially showed no preference or even concern for answering the question. He would retreat into a private conference, attended by Fabian, Roman, and Aaron Thomason to discuss the matter. While the details of what was discussed remain unknown, the outcome was that Roman would become both prime minister and the designated heir, with Fabian taking on the role of legate of House Carruthers to the Convention of Houses. Here he was to work with Vincent Thomason in chairing the Convention of Houses, given the significantly weakened and diminished role of House Gerard under Augustine Gerard. This decision was not without its own controversy, however, as many noted that Roman bore more of a resemblance to how the new emperor had looked at his age, rather than his father. This would raise questions that had previously been mere rumors among the imperial court. There had always been speculation about Alexander II's sexuality, especially given his young, predominantly male staff. Rather than confront these questions, the emperor and the new prime minister chose to ignore them. When questioned on the matter, Aaron Thomason would comment vaguely that such issues are no longer of any importance. Lacking his brother's natural charisma and not enjoying being the center of attention, he would try to find excuses to avoid the ceremonies now associated with the imperial throne. The daily levees that his brother had so enjoyed were reduced in number to 3 per week and limited to 2 hours. Even then, Alexander would only make a brief appearance and then leave matters to Aaron Thomason and Roman Carruthers. It was quickly apparent that these two were the ones actually ruling the Imperium, with rumors beginning to circulate that Alexander merely signed whatever was placed in front of him. Yet this was far from the truth. Alexander was an active ruler, but one who did not relish the limelight. He preferred to work behind the scenes, and had little interest in, or tolerance for, the rituals of state. It was his opinion that what the Imperium needed was time to adjust to the radical changes of his father and brother's reigns. He would refer to this as a process of consolidation. What few changes he did make were seemingly minor adjustments to policies already in effect. The only major project he would undertake would be the construction of a new flagship for the use of the emperor when traveling. Prior to this, the emperor would charter one of the commercial starliners from one of the major passenger lines. This practice was both an inconvenience for the shipping lines, having significant ships pulled from service for sometimes months at a time, and a security risk for the emperor himself, as these ships were only lightly armed to defend themselves against raiders. It would be during an inspection of this new flagship on August 14, 2191, that an airlock would suffer a double failure, the explosive bolts on the outer door detonating during a simple circuit test, and the inner doors failing to close automatically in response to the failure. Alexander and his inspection party had been standing directly in front of these doors when the accident occurred, and had no way to escape when the pressure doors further down the corridor closed. His death in a simple accident would unexpectedly open the door to one of the greatest periods of change in imperial history. Next time on Emperors of the Terran Imperium, the Reformers. Aaron Thomason gets more power than ever before. Alexander IV leads the Imperium in a new direction, taking on a greater role in government than any previous emperor, only for his attempts at reform to bring him to a tragic end. Trajan gives up everything when he becomes emperor, but his drastic reforms threaten the established order.